Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game video that includes a battle report. There are actually a couple of other things we'll be focusing on in this video, starting with the new scenario that's been announced in ITS and to be played at Interplanetario, Neutralization. We'll be talking about that scenario and my initial thoughts on it, having had a game. And then, while we will jump into a battle report featuring Shindenbutai versus Torchlight Brigade, we'll actually breeze through the battle report somewhat because one of the focuses we'll be doing secondarily to the scenario breakdown is a pre-battle report look at the table and doing a terrain analysis. This is something that was requested by channel supporter Connor2505. And so in this video, ahead of the battle report, we really will linger on looking at the terrain and how it impacts the battle, which I think is particularly relevant to this new scenario. So the scenario, as noted, is Neutralization. It's the new scenario for Interplanetario and it's in ITS now. You can find it in Mission Geist, which is where I got this handy dandy map layout from. In Neutralization, there are 2 tech boxes and 4 neutralizing antennas. The tech boxes are 20 inches in from the table edge and surrounded on either side by a 4-inch exclusion zone. Any specialist can activate the tech box in order to loot hypothermal tech, which they then carry. Each trooper can only carry 1 piece of hypothermal tech unless they have baggage, but as we'll discuss, that's kind of an illusory rule in this scenario. And you can also pick up hypothermal tech either from an allied trooper who is carrying it or if it's unattended on the ground. Once you have hypothermal tech, carrying it back to the neutralizing antennas will neutralize it and score you a point. Now, when I say carrying it back, there is a circular template underneath each neutralizing antenna. That is the area in which you have to end your order or ARO entirely within in order for the tech to be neutralized, and that's actually a really small space. You may as well think of it as get in base-to-base contact with the antennas, because to fit a 25mm or 40mm base inside that circular template completely, you basically have to be, for a 25mm template, you have 25mm base, you have to be within 15mm, so 1.5 centimeters, which is about half of an inch for the imperial measurers in the audience, and for a 40mm base, that's a regular medium base in Infinity, you just have to be in base contact with the antenna. What that means is that if you are bigger than that, you cannot fit entirely within the neutralizing circle, unless you are choosing to play the antennas as something that you can end an order or ARO over. In this game, we played them as solid and providing cover. We had markers for them. That's how you will often play them in ITS, and I actually kind of recommend that because of other scenario rules. You have to hide behind these things a lot of the time. And that means that if the antennas are physical, or if you otherwise can't end your order or ARO on them, it's literally impossible for any model bigger than a Silhouette 3 or Silhouette 5-6 model to actually neutralize the antenna. You physically can't fit a baggage bot, for example, inside the available space to get totally inside the neutralizing zone, so there are only like 2 profiles in the entire game who can actually make use of that. A model with baggage can carry 2 pieces and actually get it back to the neutralizing antenna. Not super relevant. Overall, what you're trying to do still is to get specialists to the tech box, pick up the tech, and then run all the way back to the antennas, where the tech will be automatically neutralized. You score 1 point for each piece of tech that you neutralize to a maximum of 4, plus 1 point if you've neutralized more, and then the final points in the game are controlling the neutralizing antennas at the end of the game. That's worth 3 points if you control more. Difficult to do because obviously to control more, you'll have to either kill the ones that your opponent has troopers and are controlling, or make a dash all the way to your opponent's side of the table. There's quite a bit of distance there, and then you have 2 classified objectives. It is relatively easy to draw this scenario, but the classified objectives will often make a bit of a difference there. Now, before I get into scenario assessment and appraisal, a couple of things that came up in the test game that I think are potentially interesting. The first is that there are common rules of those tech boxes, and they specify that a trooper can only carry 1. What they don't specify is what happens if a specialist who is already carrying a tech box succeeds on the roll to pick up another tech box. My best read of the rules is that you follow all of the usual rules, which says that when you successfully pick up a tech box, successfully pick up hypothermal tech out of the tech box, it is placed in silhouette contact with the trooper who picked it up. I am assuming that means that if you already are carrying one, and if you try and pick up another, it just is placed in silhouette contact, but you aren't carrying it because you can't. So you can theoretically have a specialist run up to the tech box and then spend a bunch of orders looting several pieces of tech, only one of which they are carrying. That could in turn theoretically open up a play where you get a bunch of tech boxes on the first turn and run them all the way back to the neutralizing antenna, and that is indeed what I tried in this mission, and what I found is there actually aren't too many factions I think could reasonably do that particularly often. It is difficult, there is just a lot of distance between the tech box and the neutralizing antenna. If I was playing Hack Islam, I might try that strategy again. But certainly without a bunch more practice, I don't think it's something that you just go in as the first order optimal strategy, and this is how you win the scenario. This scenario is a bit of a slow burn. I think it's very likely that there'll be lots of games that play all the way to round 3, trying to just get one more tech box than your opponent. And it is just so order intensive, even for a faction probably like Hackislam, who can do lots with coordinated orders, to rush a bunch of tech boxes early. You would give up any ability to alpha strike, do damage to your opponent. So there's quite a lot of nuance in actually playing the scenario because of how order intensive it is to do all of the things that you need. Many of the fastest models in the games would be things by motorcyclists, and like we said, motorcyclists can't actually neutralize the antennas, neutralize tech using the antennas because they're physically too large. So a scenario where any list with a decent specialist count can work, and you want some mobile troops in the mix as well, but probably a scenario that's hyper difficult to specialize for, which is interesting. Now, having played the scenario just once, my conclusions about it are obviously only tentative, but I think at this stage this is a scenario that will lightly favor the second player. But that's only partially because of the small advantages that going second brings. You technically do have a couple of scoring advantages in neutralization as second player. The first of those is that you know exactly how much effort you need to put into getting more pieces of neutralized tech than your opponent. This is very much a scenario where the first player will set the tempo. Do they try and do a lot of damage and leave tech boxes for later on the first turn? Do they try and rush tech boxes? Do they try and balance that out? But the second player gets to respond based on the information that they have. If the first player goes all out to attack and doesn't try and pick up many tech boxes, okay, cool. The second player can slow burn it as well and focus on using their first turn to punish any overextensions, reconstitute their forces, re-establish defenses, etc. If the first player goes all in on trying to get lots of tech boxes early in the game, okay, the second player's force is fully intact and they now have resources to respond to that as well. You really only need to score one more box than your opponent to have a pretty significant scoring advantage. That one more box is worth 2 points, effectively, and so the second player has that advantage of knowing how much they need to do in order to get those points. There is also, obviously, 3 points on the line for controlling more antennas at the end of the game, and the second player will have the most options in terms of how to pursue that compared to the first player. I am always quite wary of over ascribing second player advantage to end of game objectives though, because there are 3 whole turns you have to play in between now and scoring those points, and a lot can happen in that time. The first player might do a lot of damage, they might launch a really effective alpha strike, and sort of far too often I have seen a player choose to go second in a scenario that has distant end of game scoring and just get clobbered in the process of trying to just knuckle down and hold for 3 entire rounds. So it is still a second player advantage, a small one, to know where they need to go to control more antennas, but I wouldn't over ascribe advantage to that. Nevertheless, the reason why I still think this is probably at least a lightly second player favored scenario is because the second player is almost always going to be the person who picks deployment side and deploys second, and that is a very significant advantage in this scenario. When we look at how this scenario is laid out, all of those objectives are very important, and their locations are more likely than almost any other scenario to be heavily influenced by terrain. The antennas are literally on your deployment zone line, and so there is a very high likelihood that how the deployment zones are set up impacts both the accessibility and the defensibility of those antennas, how likely you are to be able to easily get back to them and score points, and how likely you are to be able to hold them at the end of the game. That's very significant. If you're going second and therefore deploying second and picking deployment sides, you can choose to give your opponent antennas that are, for example, very difficult to get back to or very difficult to defend at the end of the game and therefore control. Now, that's contingent on the terrain being conducive to that, but I would expect at least some advantages to accrue there because deployment zones often have, interesting and defensible terrain in them. And then additionally, the tech boxes you will note are very close together. There's only 8 inches between the two center points of those tech boxes, which means that individual terrain pieces, etc., are likely to very significantly impact which side of the table has the easiest ability to defend, control, and access those central tech boxes. A single repeater can very easily cover both of those tech boxes once you get it in place. And even with the exclusion zone, something like, say, a Nomad player with a single Masai Moran, with the right deployment conditions, should be able to have that single Masai Moran in a very annoying place for anyone trying to access those tech boxes. And all of those factors combined, right? The fact that you're looking for accessibility and defensibility of the antennas, and accessibility and defensibility of the tech boxes, and that terrain is very likely to impact all of those things, means that I suspect this is one of the first scenarios we've seen where it's going to be quite common if you win the lieutenant role to pick deployment side and deploying second, not because the scenario itself enormously advantages going second, but because the terrain is likely to be that meaningful in many cases. All of those things collectively produce a scenario I'm very interested in, and I'm very interested to play more, but it is a very demanding scenario. I think it's one that could produce a lot of different play experiences because of how the first player gets to set the rhythm and the second player gets to respond, and the first player has many options in how they choose to have the game play out. And there are even interesting little things that can occur where, because it is very order intensive to get back from a tech box to a neutralizing antenna, you can have situations where a trooper gets most of the way there and hunkers down and is still carrying a tech box. That tech box can be stolen from that trooper. If they're killed, they'll drop it, and an opposing trooper can pick it up. Now, then they would have to get all the way back to their antenna, but you can actually have fights over dynamic objectives that emerge in the midfield just because it may be a little bit too difficult for players to safely get the tech back to the neutralizing antenna in a single turn. That is interesting. Even with the exclusion zone, the scenario is quite conducive to the use of combat jump and infiltrators, because anything that gets you closer to the center or in position to defend the center is good, and anything that lets you turn up and attack those neutralizing antennas late in the game, or even just come in behind troopers that are focused on the midfield, combat jump is useful. So there's a great deal of play in this scenario, and I don't feel like any faction is particularly advantaged or disadvantaged. I would feel comfortable playing this as Ariadna, as Toha, as Pan-Oceania, as JSA. I would feel very comfortable playing it as Hack-Islam, because Hack-Islam coordinated orders are one of the good ways to make that rush for tech boxes, but until I try that at least once, I can't even be particularly sure that is actually the best way to play it. I'm giving up quite a lot to do that, and even the score more tech boxes points don't actually get you over the line unless you also do your classifieds and at least contest the controlling antennas. So, very interesting scenario. My first game with it was very awkward. We'll cover that as we go through and play. It really is absolutely a squeeze in terms of your order count and how much you have to do if you want a really high score in this scenario. But that's an interesting tension. I had a good time. And in short, I'm looking forward to playing more of this. And speaking of playing, let's now get into our battle report and our terrain analysis, because as we noted in this scenario, terrain is a pretty big deal. So here's the list that I'm playing for this game, and it's a slight tweak on a list that I've actually played at least once before on the channel. This is the Tanuki are a mythological creature known for their huge disco balls list, using JSA Shindenbutai and a bunch of Tanuki teams, but the stars of this list are actually the double Hatamoto Imperial Guard, because what this list is really trying to do is whatever it needs to do to get a Hatamoto into close combat, at which point you experience that sweet, sweet endorphin rush of just absolutely fucking something up. So in Combat Group 1, we have a Tanuki Multi-Track Visor level 2 with Heavy Machine Gun. Having now played this list once, I'm actually seriously considering changing this for a multi-sniper. It's linked, it's in a duo with the Yamabushi, and especially after playing this game, what I really found was that my only anti-armor was in close combat with swords. Now, that's fine, but the reason why I shifted this Tanuki gun into the list in the first place is to have some suppression of enemy ARO options, and a HMG firing through smoke with the MSV2, we have a single source of smoke, but it's fairly reliable. The HMG firing through smoke is very good at suppressing things like total reaction bots, but can't necessarily take multiple rounds to do something like put down a heavy infantry or a tag or anything tougher than that on ARO duty. That would prove to be a little bit of an issue in this game, and I save some points if I switch to the multi-sniper, which could be used for upgrades elsewhere. So we're duoed with a Yamabushi FTO, and there are 2 linked FTO Yamabushi in this list. Part of what they are doing is testing one of the theories that I wanted to with this list, which is how the hell do I defend with Shindenbutai if I need to put up AROs? Shindenbutai do have a couple of nominally purpose-built ARO pieces, but their total reaction bot sucks ass. And in any case, it's not really a faction I'm reaching for an engineer in. And the Yamabushi were what came to mind. Linked, they still have mimetism, passable ballistic skill, and they're firing off 1 dice plus 1 special dice Panzerfausts. Or at least, they would be if I'd taken the Panzerfaust profiles. Okay, they're firing off 1 dice plus 1 special dice tactical bows. This would actually matter in this game. I played them in the entire game as the Panzerfaust profiles, not the FTO paramedic profiles. There is an FTO Panzerfaust profile. So I'm going to have to remember to give myself 2 extra points because I never used them as specialists, I just used them as the Panzerfaust AROs. So we'll just adjust that on the fly for next time we play. That actually opens up some interesting options, but cool, well done, Rob. I could cut this, but I'm leaving all of this in. Cutting the Yamabushi down to the Panzerfaust options frees up 1 point each, still linkable. And cutting down the Tanuki heavy machine gun to a multi-sniper also frees up some points, which is 4 total points in the list. I have no idea what I'm going to use that for, but I think I can probably use it for something. So maybe there'll be a version 4 of this list at some point. Just bearing in mind, although it says tac bow chain rifle FTOs in this particular version of the list, we are not hurting the specialists. We do not need the paramedics. They are meant to be the Panzerfaust profiles, and they'll be played as such. We've then got, there are 2 Tanuki hackers in this list, and those are doing an enormous amount of work. Submachine gun's not important. Pitcher and Disco Baller is, and they'll be using both of those over the course of the game. Linked, good quality ballistics like Ballistic Skill 13, linked disco balls on upside profiles are fantastic, and in this game, a large part of their purpose is to enable the 2 Hatamoto Imperial Guard to get into close combat. So there's the Tanuki and Yamabushi duo, then there's another Tanuki hacker and chain of command because we have a very active lieutenant. That's also a duo. It will never be doing any gunfighting, but +1 special dice on both the pitcher and the disco baller, very good. We then have 2 Hatamoto Imperial Guards. Both with Spitfires, we could cut them both down to Red Furies to free up even more points. That would give us 6 points to play with in this list, which will almost certainly afford something interesting. 1 Lieutenant with +1 order and 1 NCO. They are our all-stars. They are very, very good. They're just awesome and fun troops to play with, and they are intensely dangerous in close combat. A point I've made in the past is that a burst 4 gun on them is not really to kill things, although it can do that. It's a gap closing tool to win face-to-face rolls on the way into close combat. In both combat groups, we then have 2 Kyojin killers, and these are doing the second part of that how do I ARO thing, Heavy Flamethrower and Flamen Spear. If these get to do stuff in active turn, that's fantastic, but their primary goal is to be road bumps to allow the rest of the list to get a first turn, and with both a Flamen Spear and a Heavy Flamethrower and decent enough ability to dodge maybe into close combat, they are a serviceable enough speed bump, and we need that in this faction. We've then got a baggage bot. There are a lot of deployables in this list, so that is worthwhile. And then a guided missile launcher, because we're firing out pitches and we have Spotlight in ARO, may well be worthwhile. And we have loads of SWC. This is actually running under SWC. We could have 7 in this list. That might be something to consider about how we spend our points. We then have a Rushi MSV1 with Mine Dispenser. This is just for area control utility. It's a decent enough gun. We could actually upgrade it, or we could possibly change it out for something else. There are probably just about enough points to maybe get this up into, say, a Tanuki gun, which would be very interesting. A Tanuki hacker. And the second Yamabushi, as a reminder, no Takbo, no Paramedic, it will actually be the Panzerfaust profile. And then Yojimbo, a Kyojin killer, and a Robo Ibot. This is just a Flash Pulse remote. Yojimbo is very important in this list, and I actually much prefer him dismounted because he can go in more places as a result. He is our source of actual smoke grenades on Phys 14. That's useful for a bunch of reasons, just to supplement the disco, but in addition, we've got this MSV2 HMG, that really wants to be able to shoot through smoke because it doesn't otherwise have any Viz mods. Yojimbo is also just a great close combatant in Combat Group 2. He will score CC attack kills this game. And even if nothing else happens with him and he just sits around throwing smoke, he can also use his regular order just to lay out crazy koalas, which he then refills off the baggage bot. He's a very nice piece in this list. There's a lot of utility and is very dangerous in his own rights. So this is a list that is built to be like proper JSA close combat. It's meant to get into close combat with the Hatamoto and with Yojimbo and then just mess people up. Because the Hatamoto are themselves specialists, you do not struggle for specialists. You've also got the Tanuki, you've got Chain of Command, the hackers. There's loads of specialists in this list, even if we don't run the Yamabushi as paramedics. And so it's just a really nice, well-rounded, works in just about every scenario. The only scenario I think I wouldn't be comfortable taking it in is maybe Evacuation, and that's just because the Hatamoto have Frenzy, and that can get real awkward in a scenario where you have to civ evac. But for this scenario, as a this works in every scenario kind of list, felt totally fine, and it would mostly be. Now for this game, I'd be playing against one of our local players, Rob, who is back on his Torchlight Brigade, and this is a serviceable enough Torchlight Brigade list. There's a few things we could in retrospect change, but it's running a double wrecker list. We start with 2 Moonrakers because this is Torchlight Brigade. You should probably just about always take 2 Moonrakers. They give you a fantastic crumple zone. They answer the question of how you defend. And then a Raven Eye Lieutenant with a Raven Eye Chain of Command. This is kind of funny because it means that the Raven Eye Chain of Command having Hollow Mask actually allows it to act as a decoy for the Raven Eye Lieutenant with Hollow Mask, while both still benefiting from their mine layer with EM mines, because the Raven Eye just pretends to be whatever and puts his mine down, and then the Raven Eye Chain of Command pretends to be whatever and then puts his mine down. In this case, Rob would have both of them just pretend to be Raven Eyes. So I could see 2 Raven Eyes with 3 mines because they were using the Hollow Mask and still using their mine layers. The mines would actually be super relevant in this game because what am I trying to attack with that's very aggressive in this list? Heavy infantry, Hatamoto Imperial Guard, and I really don't want to risk them walking through an EM template, so very useful. 2 Moonrakers with mines, 2 Raven Eyes with mines, good, that's nice close-in defense. We then have the first of 2 Wrecker teams, so this is a Wrecker with heavy rocket launcher, duoed with a Kludger. That's just an engineer. This is a solid engineer. It's got a little bit of gunfighting, but it's a disco ball and an engineer, 23 points. But I do think it's probably a mistake to take 2 of them because we'll see a second one of these duos in the second combat group. One of the kind of misapprehensions or misappraisals Rob made about this list when he was writing it was that the wreckers were dangerous. And they are dangerous, but they're dangerous if they hit you. Those heavy rocket launchers are stacked with damage mods off of a wrecker, but it's still just a burst 3 ballistic skill 13 gun with no mods. If it hits you, it will probably mess you up, but it has to actually win the gunfight. It's a 51 point tag, right? There are some limitations you have to expect, and so I think it would probably be valuable in this list to at least have the option for the Wreckers to duo, just for that extra burst, and frankly as a very solid quality defensive piece. Speaking of interesting defensive pieces, actually, there's a little bit of tech here that I kind of liked, which is a very simple duo of a Hellblazer. It's 18 points, it's cheap, and it counts as a Silver Star with a missile launcher. 31 points for this Silver Star is, but the interesting thing about this guy is that he's not just an ARO piece. It's kind of interesting and multi-role. He would actually score plenty of kills or do plenty of damage this game, but the missile launcher would be annoying. It would never really take a fight. I would just have to avoid it because I couldn't really put it down easily by just smoke shooting it with a HMG. Never really had time in any case. But if, like, once he is finished being an ARO piece, maybe he takes a wound and drops prone, maybe your opponent just avoids him. Silver Stars do have some advantages that are really interesting. The first is that a +1 burst heavy pistol in a pure duo is firing 4 dice on serviceable ballistic skill with serviceable damage, and then tactical awareness is quite good, and you will actually use tactical awareness because the Silver Star itself is a specialist. The fact that all Silver Star Rovers are specialists kind of makes this pure duo surprisingly interesting, and you could absolutely change the missile launcher out for something like a HMG, and all of this would still work, but the missile launcher gives you an interesting ARO option. We then got in Group 2 the second Wrecker and Kludger, the Kiata Flash Pulse Bot, a single Tinker. To note, she's not going to be giving her bonus. She's a tag com, I believe. No, never mind, just checked, she's not. So single Tinker, useful enough piece, adhesive launcher rifle, is herself a repeater, is a specialist, etc. Then a Fuzzbot Evo Hacker. The Evo Hacker is in this list for a very specific reason, which is that every time Rob has played against me using Wreckers, I have possessed one and he's had a terrible time, and so the Evo Hacker is just there for Fairy Dust, which he will just not have the orders to put up. And then finally a Sasha, because Sashas are quite useful, and in this scenario she would be very useful. Now, the only thing that I would immediately change about this after playing the game and talking to Rob about it is this list really wants an NCO. Just any NCO. You've got a Raven Eye Lieutenant with +1 order, get an NCO in there. And what we have kind of leaned towards is you should be able to find points. You have to cut a Kludger and then something else, or trim some things down, but you can find points in this list to fit either a Firebat or a Strider. Either of those two is a very serviceable NCO, depending on what the mission wants. Probably downgrade the Fuzzbot, right? Cut the second Kludger Engineer, re-rack your combat groups a little bit so that the Wreckers can duo if they want to, or you can just keep the Wrecker Kludger team, get an NCO in, and you're off to the races. Overall, perfectly serviceable list, very solid, was fun to play against, but it does need to make use of those disco ball visibility control options to get the wreckers fighting things they can punch down into, because a wrecker can't really punch up. So, here's our table, here's our initial deployment. Let's talk terrain. As a reminder, thanks to channel supporter Connor2505 for asking about this. And they're interested in things like defensive positions on either side of the board, avenues of access to objectives, avenues of assault for offensive pieces, and all of those things are very relevant to this scenario. Now, in this case, I have won the lieutenant role, and this was completely approaching the scenario from first principles, not really thinking about how it would be best to play. None of that information I have now about how important I think table sides are. I chose to go first, and so Rob, quite sensibly, sat down, looked at the table, and gave a lot of thought to how the game might play out. Firstly, let's just take a look at where the objectives are. I'm going to circle all of the objectives. We can see there the 4 neutralizing antennas and the 2 tech boxes in the middle. What conclusions can we draw about the defensibility and accessibility of these pieces? Well, in terms of accessibility, all of them are relatively accessible, with the note that this one on the rooftop here is perhaps a little difficult to get back to, but it's also one of the most defensible pieces because approaching it is not necessarily easy. This one over here is an almost perfect mix of accessibility and defensibility. Once you grab a piece of tech from this tech box, you can scooch back around here, and you have lots of total cover from the enemy deployment zone on the path back. And once you reach this tech antenna, neutralizing antenna rather, you have a lot of total cover to take advantage of, positions you could run back to and hide, making sure that the piece that runs back to it is in a good position to be safe. By comparison, the antennas on the other side of the table, which will be my deployment zone, are certainly very accessible. This one here is an almost perfect straight line move to get back to it with whatever model might come out, might leave this tech box over here, and this one's a little more awkward, but is still mostly some straight line movement if you need it. However, these two are difficult to defend. This one here in particular is very susceptible to overwatch from places like this rooftop, which has a very clean firing line down towards that antenna. The antenna over here on what would be my right side of the table is harder to subject to ARO, but there's no cover around it. There's literally nothing in this space apart from hiding behind this wall here, which can easily be approached and flanked to give you a defensive position to a trooper that runs back to that position. And indeed, I would end up having a model back there that would really end up just getting shot to hell, even though we are playing these antennae as physical, silhouette, 6 in this particular case to give account to the height of the antennas. That's still only so much cover. It's very easy to see a model around a circular base, and it would not survive the things that I put there through to the end of the game. Now let's talk about the antennas that are in the middle of the table, the tech boxes. There is a significant, so this one here is quite accessible to both players. This one is less so, and that's going to prove to be an advantage. This is inside this interior space, this building, like this is a big garage, it's got some cars on the inside. We're treating it as infinitely tall, although it's quite tall in its own merits, and there are only 3 entrances. There's one entrance here, and then there are 2 entrances here and here, which make this space here, this is like a very easy space to hide in, and a difficult space for me to approach from my deployment zone. Conversely, it's very easy for Rob to get in and access this tech box if he needs to, with the caveat that getting back to this antenna over here is going to need a mobility skill to easily do so, because this antenna, neutralizing antenna, is on a rooftop. Fortunately, Rob's got some super jump specialist in the form of Kludgers. So just in terms of the mission accessibility, the left side of the table here is advantaged pretty significantly. It's got better ARO positions, it's got good ability to put Overwatch down over multiple antennas, because the approaches to this one, multiple tech boxes, because the approaches to this one are more awkward for me, and Rob is going to make excellent use of that. And this is basically all appraisal that he did before picking deployment site, and I think he assessed it correctly, and it's one of the things that has informed my opinion on this scenario. Now, having been decided that I will be deploying on this side of the table over here, how do I then assess the table in terms of how I'm going to play it? Well, it will depend on the list that I'm playing and what that list wants to do, but generally I'm looking for a few things. I'm primarily looking for pathways, I'm looking for nooks, and I'm looking for firing positions that I can occupy with my pieces. So what do those things mean and why do I think about them in that order? Pathways first, just your lines of movement up and through the table. This is often going to be determined by what your opponent can see and where you can put visibility control, but just how do we physically move around the table? And this table offers a few ways to get around. From my deployment zone, if I wanted to attack the opponent, from bottom to top, there is a pathway up and around here that should be reasonably covered from ARO positions. We could also attempt to go across this rooftop or up onto this rooftop and through this way. That will be quite exposed, but it is an option. We will take it over the course of the game. There is also a pathway up and through here that could then split out into multiple assault options, but that had better have very good visibility control because almost all of the opponent's deployment is able to cordon in on and observe that pathway and therefore potentially defend it. We could have a pathway up and through the building, but it will have very constrained exit routes into our opponent's side of the table, so again, possibly quite easy for my opponent to watch. And then there are two notable pathways up the top side of the table. The first is through this nook here. There's a little alleyway back there. It has many of the same disadvantages of trying to come through the building, but it's going to be easier to block off with smoke, and I have the option of splitting around and going around behind this building if that's a better option. And then, of course, in basically the same path, we could come up and around behind this building here and up and around here. If that's not defended, spoiler alert, it will be, but if that's not defended, that could be a very good line of approach. So we've got multiple ways of potentially getting toward my opponent's deployment zone, especially with a list like this that wants to get into close combat and has good close assault pieces. That's something that I'm thinking about. If I don't particularly care about my opponent's DZ, I almost always care about my opponent's DZ. It's where their stuff is going to be, and killing your opponent's stuff is good. But if I don't care as much about what's my opponent's deployment zone, then I think about the other places I would want to approach, which will usually be scenario specific. Now, one of the utilities of thinking about all of these paths that could be taken to get to my opponent is that all of them work in reverse. These are also all of the paths that my opponent could take to reach my deployment zone and come and kill my stuff. So I have to think about what I position to stop that. How do I defend those elements? Where do I position stuff to not be vulnerable to attacks along those pathways and to defend those pathways with my ARO pieces? Now, the second thing I tend to just always scan the battlefield for is nooks. This is just an easier way of thinking about defensible positions, and it's kind of just a shorthand, but nooks are very useful. A nook is something where you kind of just are able to put something in where it fits and is difficult to like easily approach or get line of sight to, or where there's like lots of line of sight blockers that are protecting it. Corners in terrain that like face your opponent, and I'll use some examples, are often they just tend to be really useful. So here are some examples of some nooks that would be useful to me over the game. We can see that this sign and this wall form a nook that my opponent can't get around to unless they come all the way around and approach it from my side of the table. That would be a fantastic spot to put something like a deployable repeater or a mad trap or Yojimbo, because it is simply very difficult to approach. Over here, we can see this garden bed and this wall. It's not a perfect nook because it can be approached from this direction, but it's a pretty good way to hide something. In my deployment zone, this is an excellent nook here. This is a nook. Over here, this bridge is forming a couple of different nooks, and these are all places, this garden bed here and this wall is forming a nook. These are all places that are very difficult to easily catch in enfilade fire. What is enfilade fire? Enfilade fire, technically it's a trench warfare term, where you are shooting up the length of a trench. The trench offers no defense, and you can catch everyone caught in the trench. It is a concept that applies a lot to Infinity, because as soon as you have a bunch of people in cover up against a straight line and your opponent gets around that, they have a fish in a barrel firing gallery. Putting your models in nooks like this means that they are the hardest to reach, because just getting around and approaching the damn things tends to be difficult. It's not easy to just shoot those pieces from anywhere in the midfield, for example. And so that's kind of my mental shorthand for what is a defensible position and or a useful position is those places on the board. Like here's another example. For example, this here is a fantastic nook because it just can't be approached. If you're prone behind this rampart, it just can't be approached except by coming all the way around it. If I have a Kyojin killer up there or a mine, for example, It's just not going to be engaged except on my terms. And of course, on my opponent's side of the table, this entire garage is nothing but a fantastic nook, and there are lots of useful ones throughout the deployment zone, etc. These are elements in terrain that are either immediately or likely to be useful in future, especially if you have troopers that you want to squirrel away and keep safe in the midfield, defensive positions you want to occupy. If you're moving a link team forward and you want them to not just all be clustered together, look for parts of the table where there are a few nooks all together where you can keep pieces safe from assaults by your opponent. And then the final thing that I sort of look for just in terms of the scan of the table before the game begins, before I have any more context, is firing positions or staging positions or assault positions. Is there anywhere on the table that if I get to, I could really spool up with a big gun and potentially see a lot of my opponent's positions? Now, this is the last thing I tend to look for because it's often not something that you can assess until you know where your opponent's troops are. And so especially deploying first, going first, you'll often be looking for firing positions that really let you see into the midfield or where you expect your opponent will go, right, towards mission objectives, or which give you some flexibility. High ground often presents a very good firing position, but there can also be enfilade firing positions where if you just move up and get a line, could do a lot of damage. I don't look for them as much. Say, for example, with this list, I didn't really scan the battlefield because there's only a few guns in this list that are looking to do that, but I will call out a couple. The first is this bridge and this rooftop here are high ground accessible from my deployment zone that could offer some really good positions. I end up deploying the MSV2 Tanuki heavy machine gun over here, and as it moves forward along this bridge, it's going to be able to see a bunch of different rooftops and into the midfield a bunch, and then once it sort of crosses over this bridge, there's a big sort of sign here that's sort of cut off a little bit in this photo. Once it gets to be able to see past that, it's going to be able to see down onto rooftops and into my opponent's deployment zone. It won't have unfettered lines of fire, but it is potentially a very solid firing position in addition to being able to shoot things, say, on these rooftops, and maybe even continue further down and put plunging fire down from this rooftop here, although that would be this bridge here, but that would be very aggressive. The other firing position that leapt out to me immediately on this table is any run all the way up the flank here, if it's uncontested, can start shooting along the back of my opponent's table. You will see this relatively often. Only some tables will actually put like blocking terrain that bisects a deployment zone. I don't actually look for blocking terrain. When I'm looking for a good deployment zone, I'm usually pretty happy if there isn't terrain right on the back of the table edge, because parachutist deployment zone troopers can use that to mess you up. But you do absolutely want to make sure that if your opponent just runs up the side of the table, they don't get to just shoot your entire army in a line. You have to deploy in a way that stops that from happening. I did not expect, and indeed Rob would not deploy multiple vulnerable troopers along this back table space, but he would end up deploying one that I would be able to get, engaging with a gun up this line here. So that is a second kind of firing position that I look for. But this table fundamentally pretty dense. There's a lot going on, a lot of rooftop play, there's a lot of bits and pieces, a lot of scatter. And so the gunfights that would occur would mostly have to be just gunfights of opportunity. Now, sometimes that's not the case. If you're playing on a more open or a wide table, you probably need to be really thinking about, especially where can your opponent put defensive pieces or ARO pieces. If you have a flyer or your opponent has a flyer, what's the high ground that flyer can get to that it can then in turn make really powerful plunging fire attacks from? These rooftops, for example, especially these two-story rooftops here, had there been a flyer in the game, could have offered really powerful plunging fire platforms all the way down into my deployment zone and onto various rooftops. I would have been safe in this nook here and here, because these are tall enough even for a flyer scooching upwards and then back down on this rooftop. Even in those positions, a model here would have been safe, but it's still stuff you have to be very cognizant of. Just where could some gunfights occur from? Again, this is usually the third thing that I look for, because it's just fundamentally context dependent and you don't have that full context until everything is deployed. Now, the final thing that I tend to do when I'm thinking about deployment and where to deploy things is just some deployment zone checks from my opponent's side, even if I'm going first. Just jump around to the side of the table, scooch down, take a look at eye level, see what models that they might deploy could see, and do your best to keep your models from having a bead drawn on them from beginning of the first turn. You just do that check, you just look, you think about where you might put ARO pieces, you can just scan the horizon basically. And in that vein, I determined when checking Rob's deployment zone that I could expect potential AROs from this rooftop, and from this rooftop, and from this rooftop, and from this garden bed looking up in this direction, and that almost all of those positions might be able to draw a line down to this tech box, and that tech box was where a lot of my game plan would need to be focused, because getting to this one was going to be a pain in the ass. Like, frankly, if I could get to this tech box here, then, like, if I could get to this tech box, by definition, I could probably get to the other one and it would be closer. So I pretty much focused all of my gameplay on this tech box in terms of getting stuff out of boxes. And there you go. That's a rough guide on how I appraise the table and some things that I look for and some things that I found on this table. This was a table that had a lot of nooks. I love that in a table. This is a table that had, despite a lot of terrain, had a lot of avenues of approach, a lot of pathways models can take. I like that in a table as well. And by all means, mentally insert the Obama awarding himself the Nobel Prize meme here, because yeah, this is a table that I set up. Of course, it's a table that I was going to like. I don't set up tables that I think are bad. I play on tables that I like to play on. That's a sort of tautology there. But this would be no exception. I would have fun playing on this table. Now, as noted, I'm going first. And now let's just rapid fire really quickly through how this played, because this video has already been 40 minutes long talking about terrain and scenario and stuff. The important thing for my initial deployment is that I had rolled up the tactical support option. By the way, Mission Guys just makes tactical support so much easier to do. I had rolled up the ability to give one specialist reroll on every scenario roll. That would be given to a Hatamoto Imperial Guard, whose job it would be to get to a central antenna and just rummage through it, pulling things out of it for other things to take. That was the plan. Wouldn't actually work super well because of how order intensive this scenario would end up being. I've deployed with reasonable amount of disco coverage and picture coverage across the board, but there is a slight note with my deployment in that the two Tanuki hackers and their respective teams are deployed behind this building and on this rooftop. This is a crap deployment under normal circumstances, but I knew it was safe for my opponent's DZ and the plan was for them to move. That actually wouldn't end up being a fantastic plan, but needs must. I'll be able to put smoke in this direction, smoke in this direction, and they're clustered around the baggage bot so that they can reload at the end of the turn. The HMG, as noted, is on the rooftop, and our two Hatamoto Imperial Guard are deployed, one on this rooftop over here, that's the lieutenant, and the NCO is going to be deployed kind of on the deployment zone line here. It's the one that will be running towards this tech box. Yojimbo was my reserve drop, deployed to over here to be able to run forward and play smoke, although he would end up circumnavigating the board. Basically, he'd have a lot of things to do. For my opponent's deployment, we've got Moonrakers fucking everywhere with camouflage markers, good use of them. Cordoning off, for example, this tech box here, and the approaches along here, this position here and here. And then we would have a couple of things that were quite important. We would have the Sasha over here roll up 8-4 movement. That's going to be a big deal. We have the missile launcher and Hellblazer combo. The missile launcher is an excellent ARO piece in this case, as it has good visibility over this antenna, but more importantly, it has excellent visibility on the path back from the antenna toward the neutralization and from the box to the antenna. Fucking weird scenario objective names. Finally, the very important things otherwise are two wreckers. One is deployed here, ARO, and one is deployed all the way back here, watching this line down here, because Rob has correctly identified that I would like nothing more than to run this Hatamoto Imperial Guard up the guts towards him, and while I do trust the Spitfire to work as a gap closing tool, I'm not super keen to have to take that fight 2 or 3 times, because one hit from that Wrecker heavy rocket launcher is still going to be pretty scary for a piece like a Hatamoto. Now, I give some consideration to, can I go up the guts and do a bunch of damage on the first turn? And I decide, no, I probably can't. And so we put that scenario plan into play, and it very quickly becomes apparent that I've underestimated the order cost. The Hatamoto is able to get around to here and start throwing things out of boxes. He picks up one, and then we play it as the remainder of the ones he picks up, he just drops. And then I'd like to go and get some more boxes, but it just ain't happening. There just aren't enough orders to get back up to safety, and I would just be leaving boxes for my opponent to pick up. So the Hatamoto has to constrain himself to 2 boxes. He grabs one, he'll end up back on this rooftop over here, and then the other, Yojimbo, will run around, pick up, and then run back. Yojimbo cannot get, with other things I need to do, Yojimbo has to content himself just looking back here, holding the box, and hoping he doesn't die. If he dies, he will drop the box. That will be bad. I do, however, set up some of my defensive positions, which I can do with this list. I'll throw out some pitches. I will, of course, have thrown out some disco balls and able to actually be able to make this run at all, because I just ain't fighting that missile launcher right now. So we've thrown a bunch of smoke in this space here, and we'll get 2 pitches out. One of them will be put in this position here, taking use of that nook that I identified, and that will basically stop a wrecker from coming. If it wants to come up onto this rooftop, it will have to kind of stop here, because they are BTS-9, they are hard to hack, but I have 2 Tanuki hackers in ARO. I wouldn't take the risk of possession, and neither will my opponent. And then the other one is going to come down here, where it can cover both of the boxes. It will end up being dealt with. It's actually not too difficult for Rob to deal with that, but it will at least force him to do so. From the looks of it, Yojimbo has also put a Crazy Koala down here, which will do something, who cares. Rob now has to make his own play for the scenario. Unfortunately, he has a nearly perfect tool. All it needs is for her to survive. He has an 8-4 coming plus Sasha, and so she's just going to fucking wheelie shoes all the way over to here and around to this, and then an interesting thing happens. Now, all he wants her to do is to trigger a bunch of deployables. There's going to be actually a Flamen Spear from this Kyojin killer, which is, I think, run back with a box, and then 2 Mad Traps are all going to trigger in on her when he runs at this. He's like, you know what, that's fine, she's going to activate the console. She does activate the console. She also passes all 3 saves against the Flamen Spears and the Crazy Koalas, and is like, I'm alive. I'm alive. And then she just runs away, and she survives the Flamen Spear a second time, and she gets back to here, and she drops off the tech box. And that's just like, she's alive, I guess. That's an Armor 0 model. Just survived a bunch of damage 5 and 6 hits, but thumbs up. Good work, 8-4 move Sasha. MVP 6-point model. Now, that does take a few orders to do, but Rob does have some orders spare, and this is where we get into the utility of the Kludgers in this scenario. A Kludger Wrecker team is going to activate. It's this one over here. It's going to move up and around in this direction, and we're going to make use of the fact that the Kludger has Super Jump. It's going to be able to Super Jump up onto the roof. It's going to be able to use its Deactivator to take care of this repeater. It's going to get spotlit along the way, and it won't have time to clear itself, but then it will get back down into this central room here. It will pick up a box, and it will get all the way back, again using Super Jump. It will get all the way back to Zone of Control, or not Zone of Control, all the way back to the template that is surrounding this antenna, and it will neutralize the tech box. Now, technically speaking, that puts Rob up 2 to my nil, but I am holding 2 pieces of hypothermal tech, which means that I'm able to catch that up, but he is up on scenario. Now, that has produced a very interesting first turn where both of us aggressively pursued the scenario, and I think the only casualty that was inflicted was that something shot and killed the Kyojin killer over here. So both of our forces, I think it was probably like a wrecker or something. Yeah, it was a wrecker. Both of our forces are in pretty good nick, and Rob is up on scenario. But, fuck it, we're playing Shindenbutai, we ball. And so it's time to do some Hatamoto stuff, and so Hatamoto stuff we will do. This Hatamoto Imperial Guard up here is going to jump down, and there's going to be a disco ball. We're going to have to move this fire team around a little bit, but we get a disco ball basically into this position here, and that's going to allow the Hatamoto Guard, with a combination of dodges and cautious movements, to sort of get around here, cautious move into the smoke using stealth. There's no Sixth Sense nearby. We actually get, I think we get the smoke all the way, like with a bit of movement, we get the smoke all the way up, like here. It's very far forward. And he's able to like cautious move and dodge, and then eventually just get into close combat with the Wrecker. And it's like, yes, the moment that I've been waiting for all game. And indeed, the Hatamoto does not let me down. 1 hit, 1 crit. Wrecker doesn't beat either of those rolls. Please take 3 saves. Damage is not particularly high, but your armor is 0, and shung, dead. Excellent. First Wrecker down. The Hatamoto has a few more orders at that point, so he'll scooch back out through the smoke. He just spanks a mine, by the way. There is a Moonraker mine. I don't break stealth. I don't want to give things dodges. I just cop that. He'll come out and around this direction, scooch around here. He'll fire his Spitfire to kill the Evo hacker that is hanging out back there, and then he'll just chill back here. I don't want to get up onto the rooftop at this stage, because there's an EM mine from a Raven Eye up there, and we can't really make much more use of the things that are going on, but that's still a very good turn from Ultimate. We're also going to have a missile drop onto the head of the Kludger over here, so that's a good few kills on some pretty high value pieces. Now, we will otherwise have to get back to and actually start securing some actual objectives. And so the remaining orders that we will have this Yamabushi, grab the tech box. There's a stun hit when you pick up the tech boxes, but I'm not attacking with this piece, so I don't care. Yamabushi's going to grab that, and it will end up starting to make, I think it holds onto it for a while, but it will get back to an objective by the end of the game. And Yojimbo is just going to come back and around here, hang out behind this antenna over here, and he will neutralize the piece of tech that he is carrying. Now, at this point, I get my own bit of good luck. I don't consider the Hatamoto killing a Wrecker in one shot good luck. That is, frankly, a pretty normal occurrence. The missile launcher on Rob's side is going to try and kill Yojimbo. Sorry, I know it's pronounced Yojimbo, but he's definitely a himbo. And I will get quite lucky and I will succeed, I think, a dodge, and I'll just get out of line of sight. Excellent, I hide behind the antenna. Good work, Yohimbo. Now, Rob will be trying to do some damage, but this is where we start to see the limitations that the Wrecker falls under. It's just ballistic skill 13. This Wrecker is going to get up onto this rooftop, it's going to be moving up and around, it's going to be trying to take some gunfights. There's a Hanamoto on this rooftop, there's a Yamabushi, there's an MSV2 Tanuki, and it's just going to struggle to do anything to any of them. It also can't push as far forward as it like. It will end up in this position here because, as noted, he really can't deal. There's enough stuff that's cordoning off the approach that he can't deal with this repeater until he's pushed through some things here, at which point the Kludger could deactivate it, but just the order of operations does not quite work. So I get to go into my third turn, and that means it's fuck it, we ball time again. I do have to get some more boxes out, and we will get this Yamabushi out to this objective here, which will get me 3 boxes into space, because we did have the one from the Kojin killer over here before. 3 boxes into space to Rob's 2 currently. But more importantly, it is Hatamoto number 2 time. Hatamoto number 1, I think, is dead at this point, but who cares? With chain of command triggers, we still have the LT order. Let's fucking go. Hatamoto is going to do a little bit of crawling and then some running over this bridge and into CC with the second Wrecker, at which point the same thing happens again. Oh, it's happening again! Monofilament straight through the Wrecker. Love me some Shindenbutai, this faction rocks. I do take a wound from a Kludger at some point. We killed the Kludger as well, and then we just end up sort of standing on this rooftop being as annoying as possible. I have done like 0 classifieds, by the way, but I am securing my opponent's HVT. We've only got so many orders left. What can we do with those otherwise? Well, it's going to be Yojimbo's time to shine, and he's going to be running all the way up and around here. Going to lay down some smoke. He's going to stab this Shasha to death. As much as he survived many shots before, she does not survive that, and he will attempt to control this antenna. We'll have had one of the Yamabushis that dropped the box off stay behind this one, so she'll be hanging out there in cover. And that leaves Rob with I don't have a lot of pieces left. What do I do here? And he does his best to try and figure out what it is he can do to pursue some lines of play. Now, the big issue is that just too much stuff is damaged, too much stuff is in trouble. There's too much. He has not accomplished classifieds himself, and it's going to be very tricky to actually get everything that he needs in terms of securing antennas. He assesses that he really can't contest this one from me. He really can't contest this one from me. And I am holding this one as well at the moment with a flash pulse remote. And so his best line is to try and at least keep these 2 under his control. And if that happens very efficiently, maybe he can get lucky and kill Yojimbo. There is some pieces back here, like there's a Raven Eye, for example. It's just going to be difficult for that Raven Eye to do anything. So this is where the Silver Star team is going to shine. They're going to dismount. Now, I think this was a mistake, and sort of he agrees, but also it was very close come the closed in terms of assault elements to actually make the attack up this line across the back of the board. He should probably have left the Hellblazer behind. He didn't because he thought he would need it. He was right, he would need it, but I think he needed to push his luck because I've got too much stuff on ARO. Now, the Hellblazer and missile launcher Silver Star rush up here, blow this thing out, fire some missiles up in this direction, can't quite dislodge things, and then just have to, he doesn't have enough orders left, run across the gap to get into base contact with this, and at which point the AROs that come in on him end up carbonating or something, who cares, the Silver Star, and putting the Hellblazer down. Now, if the Hellblazer had taken that fight just by himself with no Silver Star, he was really hoping to rely on just surviving. There wasn't a cautious move that he could make, there was too much buttoning in, and the same dice that killed the Hellblazer would probably have killed the Silver Star, but having had the Hellblazer leave behind this antenna, the only things he had that could potentially have gotten to that antenna were pieces that had to like climb or jump up, and that was a firing gallery because my MSV2 HMG is standing here now. The Hadamon Imperial Guard is on Overwatch, and nothing could quite make it up to get there. So in the end, Rob was not able to, and there just were not enough orders at that point for this. There was a Raven Eye back here. I believe this was the chain of command Raven Eye that was back here. It could have run around, copped the Mad Trap, and tried to kill Yojimbo. But based on the position of everything, that would have been 2 orders for a very uncertain run, particularly since there's a little bit of Spitfire ARO from the Hatamoto up here. So there's just a little bit too much damage with both of the Wreckers and both of the Kludgers. And I think one of the Moonrakers and the Evo Hacker, it's just slightly too much damage. And this is still a very order-intensive scenario. Because this is an order-intensive scenario, as the second player, I think you want to really kind of like conserve your forces against those kind of alpha strikes. And the issue that Rob ran into is that every time he moved forward to fight with the Wreckers, they weren't really able to do terribly much because they're not hugely, they just can't land hits easily, and moving them forward, even though he did the right thing and pulled them back afterwards, he didn't pull them back as far as they had been, and so that still represented forward motion that I could then capitalize on and get swordsmen into close combat with them. And that is kind of what led us to the one change that we should make to this list is you do not need 2 Kludges. One was really cool. One was like a really cool piece. Disco, Super Jump Specialist, etc. Cut one of the Kludges, cut the Evo Hacker down to just something that is cheap, and get yourself in either a Strider or a Firebat, because that's an NCO. That unlocks 2 orders by itself. A Strider would be very good in this particular scenario. A Firebat would be very good generally. One of those 2 things actually opens up a huge order count in the list. Like as soon as you click an NCO into this list, if you can make it happen without cutting tactical awareness, it's a 20 order list. Like that's pretty good. And you even have the option of doing things like if you move your combat groups around, you can duo the wreckers together. At that point, 4 dice definitely helps them, and they become viable ARO pieces at that juncture. Now, there's no hacking in this list, but there are 2 EM mines in the deployment zone, there are 2 shock mines on the way to the deployment zone, and you have the ability, if you can duo the wreckers, to have quite a few resilient +1 special dice pieces. So I think the list comes together. It was very, very close, and it comes together with those changes. So very cool Torchlight list. And I, of course, was very happy as I got to live the dream of killing not 1 but 2 tags with monofilament swords with the samurai, which if you're not playing, like, that's the reason why you play JSA, right? Like, that's the actual fantasy. It is 100% the fantasy. So very interesting game, very fun game, and especially a game that helped inform some thoughts about the new scenario Neutralization, which I had a good time playing and am interested to visit. Now, that concludes this video. Thanks again to Connor2505 for the request. As a reminder, people who'd like to support the channel can do so via either the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Requests from any supporters of the channel go into the list of content to do, which I use in order to determine what we do in terms of future videos, figure out what people are interested in, and what gets made. As always, hope very much that you enjoyed this. Video for next weekend is a strict maybe because I have a 2-day Conquest event on, off the back of running a actually surprisingly large 1-day Infinity event yesterday, and so I'm likely to be pretty tapped out, but if we can do a video, we will. If we do, we'll see you then. If not, we'll see you next time. As always, hope very much you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.